Final speaker will be from the State Treasurer's Office, Treasurer Bill Lockyer.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you. You've been hearing about our state's current zombie budget. It's a Walking Dead plan. However, it's definitely not a sleeping beauty because there's a poisoned apple. As your banker, I'd like to provide some additional specifics about the result of prolonged debate and delay. About $2 trillion a year flows through my office, and a significant financing hub is the pooled money investment account. It functions kind of like a rainy day fund. Unfortunately, it's about to go dry because there are too many demands now being made on that fund for cash to pay bills, for internal borrowing, and for infrastructure projects. And there are just too few revenues to meet those demands. Prior speakers have outlined our cash flow problems, complicated by our inability to borrow in short-term debt markets. I want to focus briefly on the diminishing state dollars in the pooled money account. Our state agencies like Caltrans and Water Resources, school building projects and so on, draw on that account through loans approved by the Pooled Money Investment Board. The board is the controller, the governor, and myself. They borrow when projects are ready to go. The fund is replenished by regular bond sales throughout the year. Unfortunately, due to frozen credit markets and our own broken budget, we can't sell those bonds to meet urgent cash and infrastructure investment needs. The large institutional investors, insurance companies, money market funds, and so on, that we need are being very selective about what they buy, and they aren't buying California. And it's not just a theory. 3 weeks ago, we went to market with about $500 million in California power revenue bonds. Bonds, by the way, that are rated higher than our typical general obligation bonds. We had to reduce the transaction by 2/3 because there weren't any buyers. That's extraordinary, but it's not hard to understand why. Expecting investors to purchase our bonds now, when we can't agree on a budget that lenders can rely on, is like expecting someone to buy a stock when they know it's losing value. The result is, in 9 days, when the Pooled Money Board next meets, we'll be forced to start shutting down planned expenditures for highways, schools, flood controls, and other things. If we can't sell bonds, we can't repay the account for the loans that it makes to pay for those projects. There's a limited amount of money in the account, and we can no longer both lend money for projects and lend money to the general fund for cash flow. Well, it means that the economic stimulus that we all want won't occur. Billions of dollars that would have gone to thousands of private sector businesses, creating tens of thousands of jobs, will be cut off. I provided for you partial lists of impacted projects. It isn't selective, it isn't discretionary, there's no choice. Every region will be affected if we can't spend the nearly $5 billion that had been expected for the rest of this year and $8 billion more next year. Schools, there's several pages of schools. From Eureka to El Centro, hundreds of projects won't go forward. Here's a small example from Caltrans. 38 local traffic light synchronization projects could lose funding. Folsom Boulevard in Sacramento, Clovis and Shaw Avenues in Fresno, large projects in San Jose, Corona, and San Jose. Highway projects will be delayed or interrupted. Federal matching dollars may be lost. Examples, just some that I've provided for you. Bridge replacement in Interstate 5 in Shasta County, carpool lanes on Interstate 80 in Placer, 2-lane HOV projects in 101 in Sonoma County, the Fourth Bore Tunnel project on Highway 24 in Alameda and Contra Costa County, widening Highway 198 in Kings, new interchange on 1 in Monterey, HOV lane in I-5 in Los Angeles County, widening Highway 118 in Ventura, replacing bridges on 99 in Merced, adding the eastbound lane for Highway 91 in Orange County. And that's just some of the road projects. Kids go without needed schools. $3.1 billion of school construction projects will lose funding. They're all over the state. You have the list: LA, Fresno, Rockland, Sonoma, San Bernardino, San Francisco, Oakdale, Merced, Novato, Maricopa, Paris, to name just a few, where kids will be impacted. Conservatively estimated, those infrastructure projects represent $12.5 billion hit in lost revenues to the private sector and 200,000 jobs that we need. That's the poisoned apple that nobody asked for and nobody wants, but it's what California gets to eat if there's no budget. Let me make one last point about the cost we're imposing on Californians and our economy by further failure to balance the budget. Delay doesn't just result in spending cuts. The hit on the private sector from delay is about as big as the tax increases that the governor's recently proposed. So there's only one way to prevent these shutdowns: adopt an honest, balanced budget very soon. No gimmicks, no phony accounting, no borrowing that merely postpones the day of reckoning. Those cupboards are bare. Stop relying on the tooth fairy and other fantasies. I was honored to serve in this legislature for 25 years, including during the recessions of 73, 74, 86, 87, and 91, 92. This downturn is significantly more challenging and likely to be deeper and longer. The budget problem is genuinely different from previous ones because of years of deficit financing that have finally depleted our reserves, coupled with an inability to borrow further, either internally or externally. For years, I watched the interactions of legislators who thought about themselves as either advocates or mediators. My personal view is robotic advocacy misses the unique role of a legislature. Look at the room. You represent the diversity of California, regionally, philosophically, economically, ethnically. The legislature should, when working right, provide the social glue for a diverse, complicated society like ours. Well, each of you gets to decide to what extent you're a thermometer or a thermostat, reflecting external realities or setting your own course. What I can say for sure is that both sides, playing budgetary chicken, simply rhetorically kills foster farms. Let's not do that. Good luck and thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the members of the panel for your presentations today. And we now want to move into questions from the Assembly members as well as the senators. And we'll start in the Assembly and go to the Senate. And I believe it's about 4 o'clock, so we have an hour for questions. The first question will be asked by Assemblymember Nilo.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. This question will be for Mr. Genest. I'm not sure whether Mr. Genest is up there. I see somebody who looks a lot like him with a large mustache. Is that you, Mike?
That's me.
Okay. As Mr. Lockyer said, we do need to find real solutions, and particularly for the longer term as we address the significant near-term challenges. And as you know, Mr. Genest, fastest growing programs in the state are an identifiable few, primarily in the social services area. These programs have averaged close to double-digit growth rates on an annual basis recently, and they're continuing to balloon costs, as the LAO points out, absent any structural adjustment to them. So my question of you is it possible for the state really to address this year and next year's problem as well as structural problems if we don't address the structural issues of some of these rapidly growing social services programs?
Thank you. Well, I think the simple answer to your question is no. I think we have to look at every single part of the budget, including these fast-growing social programs. I've brought with me, just for reference, a list of the various programs that make up the state's general fund spending and what their average annual percent of growth is from 1998 right up to today, even with our proposed reductions. I will preface some of these remarks by saying, however, that our reductions are strong, they're extreme, they're difficult, they will be hard to get the votes for, they will be difficult on the people that are served. But even with those reductions, for example, the Department of Developmental Services has grown an average of 15% a year. State revenues in a good decade grow 5 or 6% a year. Obviously, we cannot afford that to continue. The Department of Mental Health similarly has grown almost 12% a year. The In-Home Support Services program has grown 13% a year. Those are interesting examples because of those numbers, but they're also interesting examples because of the people that they serve and the kinds of services they give. I, as you know, Mr. Neal, remain an advocate for cutting back our spending. But I can also tell you that I have personal experience when I worked at the Legislative Analyst's Office visiting each and every one of those programs. And it is difficult to sit in a room with a governor, this governor, and suggest cuts to in-home support services when you have been to the home of an in-home support services recipient and seen the worker bathing them or changing one of their medical devices out or even just taking them to the store. So we do not recommend or propose these cuts lightly. We do it first because it's absolutely essential, and that's the answer to your question. Yes, we have to cut in these areas as well as in other areas. But we don't take it lightly because it is very serious business. Some of the reason that these programs are growing is because the need for them is growing, which makes cutting them more difficult. But again, it's absolutely essential to do that.
The Senate Majority Leader at Assemblymember Hall's desk.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. I have a question for the Treasurer, and I'd like you, Mr. Treasurer, if you could, to outline a little more discussion on the increase in spending. I do know, members, when many of us entered the legislature, I know I entered this floor in 1998, some 10 years ago. As you know, Mr. Treasurer, at that time, obviously government was in much better shape. We had a surplus year, and we began to look in many ways in terms of how to deal with that budget. This budget year is absolutely different. I'd like to get your numbers, please, if we could. The amount of, if you will, inflation, population growth, how much have we really grown in terms of the hard number in terms of 1998 to 2008?
This is from memory. There may be someone on the panel that would have some specific information before them. What I recall is this. First of all, California's state government is the second thinnest in the nation. So in terms of our state bureaucratic overhead, and that's because we're large and you can perform necessary functions more easily than in more rural environments. Secondly, our per capita expenditures on government are smaller now than they were in 1998. Now that isn't to say there aren't lots of growth areas like you've heard people talk about for developmental services or IHSS or whatever. And if you look at inflation for the last decade, inflation plus population growth have been 46.6%. And then so that's Pete Wilson budgets, Gray Davis budgets, and Governor Schwarzenegger's time. If you look at what has grown in major program areas compared to that, there are some specific ones that Assemblyman Niello mentioned, IHSS and others, that have recently been expanded substantially. But Prop 98 has not kept up for 10 years with population growth and inflation. It's 0.2% a year less. Support for the aged, blind, and disabled is barely above inflation and population growth. Prison expenditures have grown rather substantially. And of course, we're all familiar with a recent ballooning in the elimination of the car tax and the reimbursement for those lost revenues to local governments. That's sort of, it starts from a small base, so it's kind of not a fair long-term comparison, but it's a recent significant expansion, I guess equivalent to IHSS and some of those other recent expansions. So basically, if there had been the budget cap in place that many of your colleagues propose, if it were applied to specific programs, welfare, social services generally, schools, universities, SSI, SSP, would have been well under the cap. I hope that's responsive.
Assemblymember Calderon.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to direct my question to the legislative analyst, although Mr. Lockyer, you touched on it, so maybe you might want to elaborate. But I think well, let me back up. Last year...
It's always nice to hear from my majority leader. Thank you.
And my pro temp.
Thank you.
Last year, Democrats polled the public to ask them if they perceived there was a problem with the budget. And basically, Californians didn't believe there was a problem. That every year there's a lot of talk about how serious it is, perhaps saying the sky is falling, and then magically at some point during the end of the year the budget gets adopted. So I think a fundamental question here is, given the fact that we've had bigger deficits, and I think that was touched on by the legislative, given the fact that we have bigger deficits in the past, why is this year different? Why is this deficit different than the others?
Well, I touched on it briefly. Even take at the start of the decade when we had the dot-com bust, we were coming off some very strong years. And so even though we had numbers that were floating around of $30 billion problems, we were coming off some very good years. In this case, we're coming off a very tough year. When revenues were already slowing, we had a very difficult budget problem. And so again, I think it's kind of like this constellation of events of a really precipitous drop in economic activity. We've been in a recession now for several months. The prospects are very poor for growth in the near term, huge operating deficits, a lot of solutions off the table. We've kind of finally come, I think, maybe to the end of our rope in delaying our problems from year to year. And this was, I think, the example of the budget we just passed, where everyone knew, it wasn't a surprise, there was nothing being hid, that we had a lot of one-time solutions that got us through the year. And we either don't have those or it's not going to help because of the dramatic fall off in revenues. So in my view, it is time that we kind of face the music and take some significant long-term steps to get our two lines together.